Like a ray of sunshine on a cloudy day, it's the Medicare for the Lazy Man podcast. The Medicare podcast found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He wants shyster lawyers to leave Roundup alone. It's Medicare expert Doug Jones.
Well, hello, everybody. Guess what we're doing today? We're enjoying another podcast episode of the Medicare for the Lazy Man podcast. I'm your Medicare expert, Doug Jones, as you probably just heard my Canadian nephew announce. And I am here to help you feel pretty good about crossing over from Obamacare into Medicare. Wrote a whole book about the thing called Medicare for the Lazy Man, hence the name of this podcast. And you may pick up that book at, you may pick up the book at Amazon.com. Look for Medicare for the Lazy Man or Barnes & Noble, either one of those two sources. And I will tell you that the newest edition of the book, the 2022 edition, is just about on sale. By the time you're listening to this, the 2022 edition of Medicare for the Lazy Man will be on sale. And it's pretty exciting for those of us here at the Medicare for the Lazy Man offices, because we're late this year, about 3 months late. I just had too many things, mostly personal responsibilities that I had to tend to, and I did not get the book written and published as early as I'd hoped. So if you go to look at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble right now, you're going to find the green 2022 on the front cover of the otherwise very familiar Medicare for the Lazy Man. So enjoy. So what do? We often play our 30-second radio spot, and I'm going to ask Randy if he would like to play that. And the way I ask Randy that question is to just be quiet for a while. And eventually he gets the message that, hey, I should be doing something here. And he pushes the button, and then we get to hear the 30-second radio spot. Medicare is complicated. Medicare can be confusing. Medicare is no fun to study. Will you know what decisions to make when Medicare time arrives for you? My name is Doug Jones, and I wrote a book to help you figure it all out. Medicare for the Lazy Man. It's on sale at Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com. Also, you can download and listen to my podcast, Medicare for the Lazy Man, wherever fine podcasts are given away free of charge. Medicare for the Lazy Man, simplest and easiest guide ever. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate that. Now, normally, Randy and I start goofing around and we tell stories and try to top each other with, memories from our childhood and have all kinds of fun and everything. But I've got some content today that may take up most of our episodes. So, Randy, join us, would you? I think our normal...
Mr. Jones.
I think time is going to be tight because I've got this article that you thought was going to be pretty interesting. I think so too. And even Mary said, I can't wait to assign a grade to this episode of the podcast.
Yeah, normally I look at these scripts that come in and they're all very interesting, but some are more notable than others.
Yeah, some look like they're going to be snooze fests. I know.
Well, before we get together in the studio, let me go grab my mucklucks and a pillow.
Well, in this case, I'm hoping it's going to be more interesting than that. The title of this article I'm going to read is "Why Are You Not Dead Yet?"
And that's you talk about an attention getter.
Well, I hope there's an answer to the question, why are you not dead yet? That's the article.
Well, that's a great question. And you know what I'm hoping, Doug, is that you've got a good answer.
Well, let's find out if the person who wrote the article has a good answer. It's a woman named Laura Helmuth, and she had this thing published in Slate, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a publication that might have a political bent that is probably not parallel to my political bent. But in any event, I think it's immaterial for the purposes of this article, because I think the article will illustrate why our lifespan has increased quickly and to an extent not envisioned by our forebears. And when they thought of things like Medicare and when they thought of Social Security and so forth, people were dropping dead at a much younger age. And we are now saddled with the costs of living much longer. And in fact, I think that trend may continue. But let me read this article and see what you think. So once again, the title of the article is, "Why Are You Not Dead Yet?" American life expectancy has doubled in the past 150 years. And it says the reasons may surprise you. Laura Helmuth. The most important difference between the world today and 150 years ago is not an airplane flight, nuclear weapons, or the internet. It's lifespan. We used to live 35 to 40 years on the average in the United States, but now we live to almost 80. We used to get one life, and now we get two. You may well be living your second life already. Have you ever had some health problems that could have killed you if you had been born in an earlier era? Leave aside for a minute the problematic ways you would have died in the past. The smallpox that didn't kill you because it was eradicated by a massive global vaccine drive. The cholera you never contracted because you drink filtered and chemically treated water. Did some specific medical treatment save your life? It's a fun conversation starter. Why are you not dead yet? And I will tell you that several members of my family had onset of sudden appendicitis. And I'm thinking, those people could have died very easily without quick medical treatment that may not have been available 100 or 150 years ago. So to answer the question of why people live so long today, it helps to start with how they died in the past. This much is certain. People died young, and they died painfully of consumption, which is tuberculosis. Quinsy, never heard of that term. That's tonsillitis, fever, childbirth, and worms. The first European settlers in North America died mostly of starvation with a side order of stupidity. They picked unnecessary fights with Indians. They sought gold and silver rather than planting food or fishing, and drank foul water. Global trade introduced new diseases around the world and caused horrific epidemics. And that lasted until the 1700s or so, when pretty much every germ had made landfall on every continent. Within the United States, better transportation in the 1800s, that means railroads, brought wave after wave of disease outbreaks to new cities and the interior. Pioneers died in droves of dysentery, sequestered in damp log cabins teeming with mosquitoes and vermin. Elsewhere, urbanization brought people into ideal proximity from a germ's point of view, as did factory work. Sadly, so did public schools. How did we go from the miseries of the past to our current expectation of long and healthy lives? Most people credit medical advances, said David Jones. I love that guy. I don't even know him, but he's got to be a great guy. He's a medical historian at Harvard, and he says, but most historians would not credit medical advances. One reason is the timing. Most of the effective medical treatments that we recognize as saving our lives have only been available since World War II, like antibiotics, chemotherapy, and drugs to treat high blood pressure. But the steepest increase in life expectancy occurred from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. Even some dramatically successful medical treatments, such as insulin for diabetics, have kept individual people alive, but they haven't necessarily had a population-level impact on the average lifespan. Mathematically, the interventions that saved infants and children from dying of communicable diseases had the greatest impact on lifespan. So what do we give credit to then? We can start with these simple public health advances. 1, clean water. In 1854, a physician, John Snow, traced a cholera outbreak in London to a water pump located next to a leaky sewer. Subsequently, some of the biggest public works projects in the late 1900s involved separating clean water from dirty. At first, cities ran water through sand and gravel to physically trap filth, and when that didn't work, they started chlorinating water. Lacking an understanding of germs, some people thought that dilution was the best solution, so they just piped their sewage into nearby waterways. Unfortunately, the sewage outlets were often near the water system inlets. Finally, understanding that sewage and drinking water needed to be completely separated, Chicago, and this is a big deal in Chicago, they still talk about it all the time, even today. Chicago built a drainage canal that in 1900 reversed the flow of the Chicago River. Chicago is right on Lake Michigan, for those of you that may not know, and the Chicago River flows into Lake Michigan right through the city. And so when they used to dump their sewers into the Chicago River, of course, all of that would float out into the lake from which the city of Chicago retrieved its drinking water. So what they did in 1900 was they reversed the flow of the river and sent the river water from the lake to the Mississippi, basically through the Illinois River. So Chicago River to the Illinois River to the Mississippi River. The city thus sent its sewage into the greater Mississippi watershed and continued taking its drinking water from Lake Michigan. This massive earth-moving project was the largest in North American history at the time, and it trained a generation of new contractors, many of whom went on to work on the Panama Canal and other civil engineering feats around the country. The job of cleaning up the water supply was hard, but the payoff was enormous. Some historians now attribute 1/2 of the overall reduction in mortality, 2/3 of the reduction in child mortality, and 3/4 of the reduction in infant mortality in the United States to clean water, making it possibly the biggest lifesaver in history. Another thing besides clean water is soap. The germ theory of disease didn't catch on all that quickly. One surgeon spent years trying to persuade his colleagues to sterilize their gloves and gowns. But once it did, people started washing their hands. Soap became cheaper and more widespread, and people suddenly had a logical reason to wash up before surgery, after defecating, and before eating. Soap helps to prevent both deadly and lingering infections. Even today, kids who don't have access to soap and clean water have stunted growth. I'm not sure I get that, why they would have stunted growth, but we'll give the author of the article a little bit of license there. Another element of the lengthening lifespan is better housing. City housing was crowded, filthy, poorly ventilated, dank, stinky, hot in the summertime, and cold in the winter. These were terrible conditions for human beings, but great for infectious microbes. Pretty much everyone was infected with tuberculosis, the leading killer of the 19th century, though it is remembered as a disease of the young and artistic, like Frederick Chopin, Henry David Thoreau are two famous victims. How about Doc Holliday? It was predominantly a disease of poverty, and there was nothing romantic about it. As economic conditions started improving in the 19th century, housing was built that was more sanitary, airier, more weather resistant, and brighter. Yes, a room with a view mattered. Sunlight kills tuberculosis bacteria. Another element besides the clean water and the better housing and the soap is more vitamins. After an initial period of starvation, the American colonists eventually amassed more food and enjoyed better nutrition than did people in England. During the Revolutionary War era, American soldiers were a few inches taller than their British foes. Why is that? Because most Americans had enough to eat, while only the wealthiest Europeans did. Still, on the average, American farmers were taller than laborers, and people in rural areas outlived city dwellers by about 10 years, largely owing to less exposure to contagious disease, but also because they had better nutrition. Diseases of malnutrition were common among the urban poor. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, rickets, vitamin D deficiency, and pellagra, a niacin deficiency, to name a few. Once scientists discovered the relationship between disease and vitamin deficiency, companies began fortifying foods. Iodine was added to salt to prevent goiter. Milk and bread were irradiated with UV light to simulate vitamin D conversion within the body. Overall, improved nutrition at the end of the 1800s made people taller, healthier, and longer lived, while fortified foods reduced the incidence of vitamin deficiency disorders. And then the author goes on to cite federal laws as another element in the lengthening lifespan. Just because people were eating more didn't mean they were eating well. Contaminated food was one of the greatest killers of infants. Once babies stopped breastfeeding, food exposed them to typhoid fever, botulism, salmonella, and any number of microbes that caused deadly diarrhea. Death rates for infants were the highest in the summer when the food-borne microbes thrive in the warm conditions. Refrigeration and public health drives for pure and pasteurized milk helped people keep their food safe. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 made it a crime to sell adulterated food, introduced labeling laws, and it led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. That same year, the Federal Meat Inspection Act introduced the inspection of livestock and slaughterhouses to prevent diseased or spoiled meat from being processed and sold to unwary customers. And quarantines, they say, is also an important element. Port cities suffered some of the worst epidemics in history, partly because sailors brought new diseases and strains with them from all over the world. When St. Louis was struck with yellow fever in the 1870s, the Mississippi River became a giant funnel of disease, infecting more than 120,000 people in the lower river valley. Eventually, such cities instituted quarantines, preventing sailors from disembarking if there was any evidence of disease. On land, quarantines separated contagious people from the uninfected. And vaccination is the last element in the lengthening lifespan. A smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721 led to a huge debate about variolation, variolation, variolation. Never heard of that word. This is a technique that involved transferring pus from an infected person to a healthy one to cause a minor reaction that conferred immunity. Influential author and minister Cotton Mather was all for it. He said it was a gift from God. Those opposed said that the disease was God's will. People continued to fight about variolation and then inoculation via exposure to the related cowpox virus introduced in the late 1700s. And finally, vaccination. The fight over God's will and the dangers of variolations or vaccinations, real in the past and imaginary today, are still echoing. Some woman named Anne Suchat, MD, Assistant Surgeon General and the acting director of the CDC Center for Global Health, says it was not just the scientific invention of vaccines that saved lives, but the huge social effort to deliver them to people that improved health, extended life, and kept children alive. Vaccines have almost eliminated diseases that used to be enormous killers, but they're still circulating in other parts of the world. This doctor points out that if we don't continue to vaccinate, they could come back. Well, that's what I always heard about polio, too. I grew up in an era with polio and measles and other diseases that children were not often vaccinated against, especially polio, until 1954. So I am well aware, and I'm very favorably disposed towards vaccination and vaccines in general, in spite of the recent political events. So there's a little discussion box here. What would have killed you? The author said, I asked around, and here's a small sample of what would have killed me, my friends, and acquaintances in the past had modern life-saving treatments not become routine. So one of them is Adrian's lung spontaneously collapsed when he was 18. Okay, I guess Adrian's a friend. Becky, another friend, had an ectopic pregnancy that caused massive internal bleeding. A guy had an aortic valve replaced. Another guy had St. Anthony's fire, a strep infection of the skin that killed John Stuart Mill, whoever that was. Another friend, when she was 2, had scarlet fever, which was once a leading cause of death among children, but is now easily treatable with antibiotics. Another friend was found to have pernicious anemia in her 20s. She treats it with supplements of vitamin B12. Another friend had a burst appendix at 14. I had 2 or 3 relatives that had that happen to. And another friend would have died delivering a child or later of a ruptured gallbladder. Another friend developed type 1 diabetes during pregnancy and would have died without insulin. And finally, another friend was bitten by a cat and had to have emergency surgery and a month of antibiotics, or he would have died from cat scratch fever. So those are the elements that the article says allow us to live longer today. I don't know about the cat scratch fever. That's more of a song than a
cat scratch fever.
Yeah,
Oh,
let's sing it. Let's sing it.
Oh,
Randy.
my God. Who sang that thing?
I gotta
Cat
think.
scratch fever.
I got to think. While I pontificate, maybe on the next episode, you can do some research on that. But it was very popular.
Yes, it was. Well, we're out of time.
Oh, boy.
So I just there's a couple little, ending things that we need to kind of tie up before we go. I was just wondering if you knew, this is kind of a stump the insurance expert question, but it's not terribly difficult.
Okay.
How did the doctor that discovered the way to fight smallpox, how did he initially get the idea of how to approach it?
Didn't he give himself the smallpox germ in a hope that he would become immune to it? And he demonstrated it on himself?
That's partially true, but there was some previous research or things that he began to notice in his environment that were, he put 1 and 2 together and got 3.
Okay, well, lay it on me. What happened?
Well, he discovered around his local area that back in the day, you mentioned earlier in the podcast, cowpox.
Uh-huh.
Okay, cowpox is very closely aligned with smallpox, and he began to discover that they used to have a group of folks called milkmaids.
Yes,
and they
were comely lasses.
Yes, they were. And guess what else he discovered?
Smallpox, cowpox, very closely related.
They're very closely related, and because the milkmaids were hanging around the cows with cowpox, but not really getting sick from it, they developed somewhat of an immunity to smallpox. Fantastic. So he began to notice that, hey, everybody's dying off of smallpox here except for the milkmaids. So he began to do a little research, and that's how he discovered it.
See, this is where my thinking processes probably need to be more sophisticated, because I would think, hey, it's time for me to learn how to be a milkmaid because I don't want to die of smallpox. Well, I remember reading a book about Louis Pasteur when I was a kid, and basically he did the same thing. He made the same observations when it came to rabies. And I guess back in those days, there were mad dogs, running around foaming at the mouth. And they would bite people, and half of them would die of rabies. And so he developed the theory of inoculating healthy people, or even rabid, people recently bitten with rabid dogs, to help boost the immune factors. And it was resisted by people. Oh no, don't do that. That's going to kill people.
Well, I find it interesting. Some people wouldn't, but I find it interesting that rabies to this day, if you are not dealt with almost immediately after you get bitten by a rabid animal, you're toast. It's pretty much always 100% fatal.
Plus, the treatment is painful and lengthy. You've got to take injections into your abdomen, is my understanding. And there's a whole
not a fun place.
23 shots.
Yeah, not a fun place to be. But that's a whole nother topic. I would prefer to think about the milkmaids.
Oh, me too. I'll be dreaming about milkmaids tonight as I slumber away.
So anyway, we probably better close her down for today, Doug. We have used up our time. We need to bring in I'm going to talk about bringing in the ship today, because we don't use that metaphor too often, because you mentioned the Panama Canal.
Well, I mentioned the Mississippi River full of yellow fever or whatever it was too.
Yes. I have been through the Panama Canal, so that if you haven't been through the Panama Canal on a ship, it's an amazing experience, and we'll talk about that at another time. But anyway, I was just going to basically tell the folks that the Medicare for the Lazy Man cruise ship is just about ready to hit the ocean, and Doug Jones is the captain, and the first place we're heading is Colombia through the Panama Canal.
What's a pirate's favorite letter? You'd think it would be R, but it's really the C.
Oh, okay.
I saw that on some TV show. Sorry. You wind it up. I'm going to say goodbye.
All right. Thanks, everybody. You have just spent about 32 and a half minutes with Captain Doug Jones, the insurance guy from Oklahoma, and now the captain looking for a first mate of the USS Medicare for the Lazy Man.
I already said goodbye.
Oh, say goodbye, Doug.
Goodbye, Doug.